Great. Thanks for having me this afternoon. I know it's late in the afternoon, and I know everybody's getting a little antsy and a little chatty, so thanks for bearing with me. I'll try to keep my remarks pretty brief. I was asked to sort of think about the comments from this morning, the sort of national landscape and the things that were happening, and then talk a little bit about the work that's been happening here in Illinois around credentials and higher education. There we go. So if you'll indulge me, to have this conversation, I need to do a little background and start about 2.5, 3 years ago and explain the context of where we were. We'd recently been given a Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grant. We had developed a new quality rating and improvement system, Accelerate Illinois. And the state made a bold decision to embed not degrees, but our credentials within Accelerate. And I say that's a bold decision because if you think back about Jo Ellen's data that she showed earlier, we've had credentials for a while, but it was a system that's sort of slowly getting started. So the state embedded credentials with an Accelerate. I'm not sure at that time anybody knew exactly what we were getting ourselves into. But we knew that higher education was essential in anything we wanted to do to improve the quality of our workforce. And so we sort of laid out a big question, and the big question was, in thinking about Race to the Top, how can the state support higher ed in the development and implementation of seamless, stackable education pathways for early childhood professionals? Now, I'll be honest, I wrote that a few days ago. I actually don't think our thinking was that clear. It's easy in hindsight to write a really good line like that, but actually what I think we were thinking was, we need highly qualified people, and we have credentials, we put them in Accelerate, and higher ed is key because, if people are going to get credentials, they've got to go through higher ed. And we really need it to be easy for students to go through like the 2-year and the 4-year, and there's that jump problem. So can we work on that? I think that's actually the question of where we are. But I like to say this, and I'll probably use this in other presentations later. So our first foray into this, of course, were the EPI grants. I won't spend a lot of time on the EPI grants because I know we've had a lot of conversation around them, and also because 70% of our 2- and 4-year institutions participated in the EPI grants, so you're probably very familiar, most of you, with them. I would like to say that we would be able to move that number of 70% up to 100%, but unfortunately, our Race to the Top funds are nearly depleted, and we will not be able to have a third round of grants, but we have had a lot of really positive feedback on the grants, both from grantees and others. As I think Dan mentioned earlier, one thing that we've seen is nearly 85% of the teacher prep programs are now entitled to offer Gateway's credentials. And one of the things that we found through these grants is a lot of conversations around using the Gateway's credentials benchmarks as a unifying foundation for articulation. So up above, I've listed some promising practices. You've seen some of this information before. You know some of the hard work that's been going on around common assessments, shared coursework, assessment rubrics, which I think Nancy and John are going to be talking about later today. Institutions looking at non-licensure BA programs, full articulation of coursework. Some folks focusing on early math, bilingual ESL, and collaborative and intrusive advising. And I think most of you know that there will be 2 additional reports coming out this fall, one looking at promising practices, and another a monograph that many of you are involved in writing. I think the date for the first draft is May 31st, to have voices from the field. Some people have asked me why we have such a strong interest in publishing these reports, both the promising practices and the monograph. We really believe that it's important to capture what has happened through these grants. Not only what's coming out of the grants, but the difficult work that went into the grants and the work that's happened through those grants. When I came into this position, I knew that higher ed was sort of a complex environment, and I knew there was those problems with the 2 and 4 years, and it's kind of tough to fix that problem, but I had no idea how complex the landscape actually was. I was really lucky to be accepted into a lot of your meetings to sit and listen to some of these conversations. I didn't fully realize that if we were going to do this hard work of articulation and some of the other things that were happening up here, this would pretty much all happen outside of your job descriptions. This is sort of that other duties as described. This is not your sort of typical faculty work. And so those people that sort of stood up and agreed to participate in this work were dedicated, hardworking, and they really wanted to do it for the benefit of their students. So I wanted to thank you just for participating in that. The other thing I wanted to mention is our federal officers on Race to the Top are particularly interested in this work, and that Illinois has taken a very intentional approach to engaging higher ed. So we'll definitely be sharing those reports with them as well. You know, just in case there's ever an opportunity in the future. So we were having our EPI grants. I was involved in a lot of conversations about the complexity of the field. And at the same time, if you think back to that chart that Joellen showed you, we started experiencing a dramatic increase in those interested in seeking credentials and earning credentials. I remember being at a higher ed forum meeting 2 years ago. There was a joint access and AECTE meeting before that. And a lot of people were talking about issues between higher ed and credentials, and I didn't fully understand what they were talking about, but I heard people talking about certificates versus credentials and which way my students are going to go, and completers and math and all these other issues. So what we realized, what was happening was, though the credentials had been around for a while, we were actually taking them to scale. I think Dr. Applegate mentioned this sort of scaling up earlier in his presentation. I sort of think about it as really road testing the credentials. My husband was in a car accident a few weeks ago. He was fine, but we had to get a rental car for 3 weeks. And at first he was super excited because the rental car that he gave him was a pretty decent car, and it also only had 5,000 miles on it. But we had to have this rental car for 3 weeks, and by the end of the 3 weeks, we were like, we would never buy this car because the cup holders are like, you know, vertically aligned, and we like them in the front like this, and there's like these little things and these little things. When you spend time in that car and figure out all the little things, that's when you find all those system rubs. What we started to realize was, though these credentials were really thoughtfully developed, piloted, a lot of people here in the audience were involved in creating those. Once we road tested them, we were finding some issues. So we formed a state team that I think Brian Durham named the EC Credential Work Group because we were all like, we're not good at names. So that was the interesting name we came up with. We started looking at data, trends, websites. We started looking at things like, you know, who is entitled to offer a credential? Where are completers coming through? Do certificates align with credentials? What do websites look like? What does messaging look like? And then we spent 2 days with a faculty advisory group to help us make sense of what we were hearing and what we were learning. That was a little over a year ago. We asked members of the IAI panel to come and help us think through some of this, and then had a couple follow-up meetings with them. We began working on some of those issues and recommendations, and we sort of tweaked our focus to not only thinking about a clear, seamless, and stackable pathway for students, but also system alignment with higher ed. And again, I'm not sure that I was actually thinking about this in this way. This is my hindsight message. So what did we discover? Here's some of example things that we found. And you'll excuse my slides. Clearly, I made these myself. On the right-hand side, you'll see my sort of crude version of the ECE credential level 2 through 6. Some of the things that we found were issues around alignment with teacher licensure. How do people who are seeking the Gateway's credential, how does that work with licensure? We have looked to the EPI grants to help us think through tackling some of that, and I'm going to kick this to Nancy and Jana and say that they're going to address this in their presentation about how they're addressing that in their EPI grant. Certificates versus credentials. This is an issue that we heard a lot about, and we weren't able initially to get our arms around. So what we were hearing was, I have students and they really want to get a credential, and your credential is 12 hours, but I have certificate in my program and it's 15 hours. And I'm not sure which way to send the students through. I want the student to get the credential, and their employer wants to get this credential, but I want them to get a certificate. But if they get the credential and don't get the certificate, they're not counted as a completer at my institution. And we couldn't completely get to the root of the problem of, like, well, why don't you just align your certificates to credentials and then everything will be perfect? I remember having this conversation with Brian Durham. I went to him and I said, so I know you guys collect some certificate information, but I want you to collect information around credentials because people are saying completers are a problem. And he said, oh, okay. And he said, so tell me about your credentials. And I was walking him through them, and I was like, we've got all these people that are entitled and blah, blah. And he said, so everybody has certificate programs that are aligned and they're all doing the same thing. And I was like, oh, let me get back to you. I'll have to go check that out. I was like, okay, we're not. So we know that this is a big issue. Transferable math, and I'm going to circle back to what we've done with these in a minute. Transferable math, we were hearing, we had this, at level 3, we had this thing that you had to have a transferable math. We had faculty tell us, you know what, we just tell them to skip level 3, go from 2 to 4. Math is too hard, especially if you have to take a gen ed math that transfers to a 4-year institution. We just tell them to skip it. We were like, oh, well, that doesn't really make for a good seamless pathway, right? If you're going from 12 to 60 hours, so that seems like a problem. And then financial aid, we come to find out that if you are going to pursue a certificate and get federal financial aid, your certificate has to be at least 16 hours. So faculty were saying, oh, then I just tell them to work towards an associate's degree so they can get financial aid. But then the problem is when that student stops out at getting that credential at 12 hours, it looks like a non-completer, and it actually hurts their program, right? And then we had a lot of conversation around the entitlement process. What does it mean to be an entitled institution? Right now, INCRA spends a lot of time and resources working with entitled institution to get those students in, but also when students come in to review transcripts and make sure that that they're meeting the requirements according to entitlement. And so we had institutions, the faculty that we met with said, we want you to trust us a little bit more. We want the onus to be more on us. When we say a person is entitled, we think you should trust us that they're entitled. And INCRA said, that's a really great idea. But I can't get half the people to turn in their annual reports. And we said, okay, that's a problem. So this group said, we've got to figure out a way to have an entitlement process that takes some of the stress off of faculty and gives them some more onus in decision making, but also assures INCRA that, that people are doing what they say they're going to do in the programs of high quality and so on and so forth. So that was another issue that came up. And then just this issue around communication. How do we better communicate with faculties and institutions around the credentials, and then some issues around the website. So what have we done? So many of you are currently engaged in this technical assistance project that Nancy, Jana, Diana, and Wendy are doing. We found 25 institutions who didn't know what they were getting into and agreed to work with us around this project to think about what I mentioned before: how do we align certificates to credentials? It's been an amazing process from my perspective, not having to be the one doing the actual work. Nancy and her team went out and worked with faculty at each of these institutions to try to create stackable, seamless pathways for students that would sort of mirror the Gateway's credential. They learned a lot about why this was and wasn't possible, and some things that were sort of bumps in the road. They brought it back to their technical assistance team. That team brought it back to us at the state level. And then they've been sort of tweaking and changing that model. My understanding is that work is going to wrap up in about a month. And then Nancy and her team will be providing an official sort of into the project report to our state team so that we can be very thoughtful about some of the obstacles that I think that are out there that institutions were not able to overcome in this process. A couple of other changes. Level 2, you remember I mentioned before the issue around federal financial aid. We have made a change in level 2. It will go into effect in July, a change from 12 to 16 points. We understand that this means students will have to achieve an extra 16 points. We also know that for institutions, this 16 points is a weird number of hours. It doesn't go in threes, and everything in higher ed has to go in threes. But at this point in time, we decided that we would raise it to the minimum number of hours that a student would have to receive for federal financial aid, because we know we have a lot of people going not just through the entitled route, but through the direct route. Just one thing to point out, those additional 4 hours can come from any non-developmental coursework. It can come from anything, early childhood, gen ed. We've had people say they're doing a 1-hour observation class, a 1-hour technology class. That extra hour can be in anything. But like I said, the change goes into effect in July. If you have students that you want to get in or be grandfathered under the 12-hour rule, they need to apply before July. And it doesn't matter if they finish their coursework or not. If they apply before July, they can come in under the 12-hour rule. And if you have questions about that, I'll just kick that to Andy about how you do that, right? Level 3. We made a change from transferable math to any math. We know that there's issues around gen ed math. We know that there's issues around how much developmental math some students need to take before they take a gen ed math. So what we're doing is we're changing this level 3 math to any kind of math. This could be a gen ed course. This could be a math for early childhood educators. This could be a how do you teach math to young children. It can be content or pedagogy. We are trying to open up that definition to make it a little easier for students to attain the level 3. We know that some people would really like us to remove the math requirement from level 3. We've had a lot of conversations at the state level, and because of the importance of math, because of the research that's come out about math, we are not removing math from level 3 at this point in time. There's also been a lot of people that ask us to put math in at level 4 and say, you know what, math at level 3 is your obstacle. As long as you have math at level 3 and not at level 4, people are going to continue to skip level 3. So you have to put it in at level 4. We've thought about that a lot. I would say today we are not putting it in at level 4. We know that we are in a complex environment right now, in a difficult budget time. We know that you have had enough stress and pressure on your programs. We will not be making the change to add math at level 4 right now. But I wouldn't be surprised if you saw a change to level 4 in the future. We know math's important, right? And then some upcoming work. So this is about the conversation that I mentioned before around the entitlement process and really what it means to be an entitled institution. We think, have a team of consultants that we have asked to come in and look at the entitlement process as it currently exists around gateways, to think about this balance of the entitled process for entitled institutions versus the direct route, to look at some other systems like teacher licensing, ISB licensing, see how those programs work, and to come up with a model for us about how the entitlement, not only application, but relationship might work between 2- and 4-year institutions and between INCRA. And then we will be bringing it to some committees to do some vetting around that. And then communications. Once we figure out what this entitlement process is going to look like, we will definitely be in touch, or INCRA will be in touch. We think that it might be time to start having, annual webinars on the entitlement process or something like this to keep people up to speed. Also, INCRA has heard the faculty that have said it's kind of difficult to find materials on their website, and they are doing a website redesign this fall. To try to make it a little more user-friendly to get feedback. And thank you to all the faculty that did return the survey that went out about the website. So just to wrap up, in looking at this journey that we have taken over the last 2.5, 3 years, when I jumped into this, like I said earlier, I had no idea how complex your work was and how complex it would be to sort of do what I said earlier, like how can we make a better path for students and make this alignment a lot easier. I've learned a lot. This process was an organic process, and I would like to thank all the people that were willing to jump in and do a lot of this sort of testing and trying it out with me. My state partners, IBHE, ICCB, ISB, DHS, INCRA. INCRA has approached this with amazing integrity and willingness to adapt their system. It is not easy to have a bunch of state folks come in and say, hey, I found some problems in your system and I want to fix them. But they have really opened their arms and said, that's great. Let's figure out how to do that. And that is due to the great sort of staff at INCRA and the leadership there. And also, I really want to thank all the faculty that also engaged in all these projects with us as well. I didn't realize when we offered you guys EPI grants how much work we were actually asking you to do. I was like, it's a grant, it's money, right? It's fun. And I know a lot of you guys were like, okay, we'll take the money, but I don't really want to do the work. But you did. And same for these technical assistance projects. We were like, here's a little bit of money, it's great. And I know a lot of people either didn't know what they were getting themselves into, or better yet, they knew what they were getting themselves into and agreed to do it anyway. And I just wanted to commend you for that work and allowing us to really think about how we really develop more seamless, stackable education pathways for students. Thank you.